Gospel of Mark. They reached the territory of the Gerasenes on the other side of the lake. And when he disembarked, a man with an unclean spirit at once came out from the tombs towards him. The man lived among the tombs, and no one could secure him any more, even with a cord, because he had often been secured with fetters and cords, but had snapped the cords and rubbed away the fetters, and no one had the strength to control him. All night and all day, among the tombs and in the mountains, he was howling and gashing himself with stones. Catching sight of Jesus from a distance, he ran up and fell at his feet and cried out at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, do not torture me." For Jesus had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, unclean spirit." Then he asked, "What is your name?" He answered, "My name is Legion, for there are many of us." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the district. Now on the mountainside there was a great herd of pigs feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us to the pigs so that we may enter them." So he gave them leave, and the unclean spirits came out and went into the pigs, and the herd charged down the cliff into the lake, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the lake. Their herdsmen ran off and told their story in the town and in the countryside, and the people came to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac, the man who had legion in him, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. And those who had witnessed it reported what had happened to the demoniac and about the pigs. Then they began to implore Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed began to be allowed to stay with him. Jesus refused, but said to him, "Go home to your people and tell them all the Lord in his mercy has done for you." So the man went off and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered round him, and he stayed by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came up, and seeing him fell at his feet. And he pleaded with him repeatedly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be saved and may live." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him. They were jostling him. Now there was a woman who had suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years. Having endured much under many physicians, she spent all she had without getting any benefit from it. In fact, she was getting worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up through the crowd and touched the tunic from behind him, thinking, "If I can just touch his clothes, I shall be saved." And at once the source of the bleeding dried up, and she felt in her body that she was cured of her sickness. And at once, aware of the power had gone out from him, Jesus turned round in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is jostling you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he began looking round to see who had done it. Then the woman came forward in fear and trembling, because she knew what had happened to her, and she fell before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "My daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be free of your sickness." While he was still speaking, some people arrived from the house of the leader of the synagogue to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why put the teacher to any further trouble?" But Jesus overheard what they were saying, and he said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not be afraid, only have faith." And he allowed no one to follow with him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. So they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion with people weeping and wailing unrestrainedly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and crying? The child has not died, she is asleep." But they ridiculed him. So he turned them all out, and taking with him the child's father and mother and his own companions, he went into the place where the child lay. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And at once the little girl got up and began to walk around, for she was 12 years old. And at once they were overcome with astonishment. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about it and said she should be given something to eat. Leaving the district, he went to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. With the coming of the Sabbath, he began teaching in the synagogue, and many were astonished when they heard him. They said, "Where did the man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him, and such works of power as he worked by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, surely the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Jude and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, "A prophet is without honor only in his own country, among his own kinsfolk, and in his own house." And he could do no work of power there, except that he cured a few sick people by laying his hands on them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. He made a tour around the villages teaching. Then he summoned the 12 and began to send them out in pairs, giving them authority over the unclean spirits. And he instructed them to take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no coppers for their belts. They were to wear sandals, but not to put on two tunics. And he said to them, "If you enter a house anywhere, remain there until you leave the place. And if any place will not welcome you, and they do not listen to you, as you walk away, shake off the dust from under your feet as evidence to them." So they set off to proclaim conversion. And they kept casting out many demons, anointing many sick people with oil and curing them. King Herod had heard about him, since by now his name was well known. Some were saying, "John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and that is why the works of power are active in him." Others said, "He is Elijah." Others again, "He is a prophet, like one of the prophets." But when Herod heard this, he said, "It is John, whose head I cut off. He has been raised up." Now it was this same Herod who had sent to have John arrested, and had bound him up in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he had married. For John had kept telling Herod, "It is against the law for you to have your brother's wife." As for Herodias, she had it in for him and wanted to kill him, but she was not able to do so, because Herod was in awe of John, knowing him to be a righteous and holy man, and gave him his protection. When he listened to him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. An opportunity came on Herod's birthday when he gave a banquet for the nobles of his court, for his army officers, and for the leading figures of Galilee. When the daughter of this same Herodias came in and danced, she delighted Herod and his guests. So the king said to the girl, "Ask me anything you like, and I will give it you." And he swore her an oath, "I will give you anything you ask, even half my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask?" She replied, "The head of John the Baptist." The girl at once hurried back to the king and made her request, "I want you to give me John the Baptist's head immediately on a dish." The king was deeply distressed, but thinking of his oaths and of his guest, he was reluctant to refuse her. So at once the king set out one of the guards with instructions to bring John's head. The man went off and beheaded him in the prison, and he brought the head on a dish and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard about this, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. The apostles rejoined Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away yourselves on your own to some lonely place and rest for a while." For there were so many coming and going that they had no leisure even to eat. So they went off in the boat to a lonely place on their own. But people saw them going, and many recognized them. And from every tongue they all hurried to the place on foot and reached it before them. So as he stepped ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he took pity on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. By now it was getting very late, and his disciples came up to him and said, "This is a lonely place, and it is getting very late. Send them away so that they can go to the farms and villages round about and buy themselves something to eat." He replied, "Give them something to eat yourselves." They answered, "Are we to go and buy bread for 200 denarii for them to eat?" He asked, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he instructed them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. And they sat down on the ground in groups of hundreds and fifties. Then taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and raising his eyes to heaven, the blessed and broke the loaves and began handing them to his disciples to distribute among the people. He also shared out the 2 fish among them all. They all ate as much as they wanted. They took up 12 basketfuls of the broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. And at once he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side near Bethsaida, where he himself sent the crowd away. After parting from them, he went off to the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was far out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing that they were hard pressed in their rowing, for the wind was against them, not long before dawn he came towards them, walking on the sea. He was going to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a phantom and cried out. For they had all seen him and were terrified. But at once he spoke to them and said, "Courage, it's me, don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind dropped. They were utterly and completely dumbfounded, because they had not understood about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Having made the crossing, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored there. When they disembarked, people at once recognized him and started hurrying all through the countryside and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, to village, town, or farm, they laid down the sick in the marketplace, begging him to let them touch even the fringe of his tunic, and all those who touched him were saved. The Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered round him, and they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with unclean hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews never eat without washing their arms as far as the elbow. Observing the tradition of the elders on returning from the marketplace, they never eat without first sprinkling themselves. There are also many other traditions which they observe, concerning the washing of cups and pots and bronze dishes. So these Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat their food with unclean hands?" He answered, "How rightly Isaiah prophesied about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching human commandments as precepts.' You put aside the commandment of God to observe human tradition." And he said to them, "How nicely you reject the commandment of God in order to preserve your own tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and anyone who abuses father or mother must be put to death. But you say, 'If anyone says to father or mother, whatever help you might have received from me is korban,' that is dedicated to God. From then on, you do not allow any assistance to father or mother. In this way, you void God's word by your tradition, which you have handed down, and you do many other things like this." He called the crowd to him again and said, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that goes into a person from outside can make that person unclean. It is the things that come out of a person that make a person unclean. Anyone who has ears for listening should listen." When he had into the house, away from the crowd, his disciples questioned him about the parable. He said to them, "So, do even you fail to understand? Can't you see nothing that goes into personal from outside can make the person unclean? Because it goes not into his heart, but into the stomach and passes into the sewer?" And he went on, "It is what comes out of a person that makes a person unclean. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil plans emerge: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, malice, deceit, indecency, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within and make a person unclean. He left that place and set out for the territory of Tyre. He went into a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, but he could not pass unrecognized. At once a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him and came and fell at his feet. Now this woman was a Gentile by birth, a Syrophoenician, and she begged him to drive the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Children should eat their fill first, because it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to dogs." But she answered and said, "Ah, yes, sir, but even dogs under the table eat the scraps from the children." And he said to her, "For saying this you may go home. The demon has gone out of your daughter." So she went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Returning from the territory of Tyre, he went by way of Sidon towards the Lake of Galilee, right through the Decapolis territory. And they brought him a deaf man who had difficulty speaking, and they asked him to lay his hands on him. He took him away from the crowd on his own, put his fingers into the man's ears and spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed, and he said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And his ears were opened, and at once the impediment of his tongue was loosened, and he spoke correctly. And Jesus ordered them to tell no one about it, but the more he ordered them, the more widely they proclaimed it. Their admiration was unbounded, and they said, "Everything he does is good. He makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak."